Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Reginald Blunt, and I serve as the Director of the Center for the Church and Black Experience here at Garrett-Evangelical Theological Seminary. We are celebrating our 55th year as a center with a theme of radical hope and prophetic action. And we have been blessed throughout the course of this academic year in receiving a few speakers who have been able to uplift and speak into that word. And we experienced it again today in our lecture with Dr. Michelle Watkins, and we just want to thank her again for her sharing and contribution this afternoon. And today we welcome Dr. Anthony Reddie as our James H. Cone and Emilie E. Towns lecturer this day. And so welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you to all who are sharing with us online. We heard some rumors that it might be over 300 folk who are sharing with us around the world for this lecture today, and so we are extremely grateful for your presence. In a few moments, you will hear from a phenomenal soloist, LaQuentin Jenkins, who is also a graduate of Garrett-Evangelical, so we're grateful to have him. And you will be hearing from our students who will provide readings from Dr. Towns and Dr. Cone, and who will introduce our speaker. Thank you again for being here. And now, our president.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this year's Cone Towns Lecture, which is a distinguished lectureship that honors the lives and legacies of two of Garrett's most distinguished alumni, James Hal Cone and Emilie Maureen Towns. It's a gift to gather again in this sacred space, both in person and across the digital distance, for what's quickly becoming a defining moment in the life of Garrett Seminary. You know, when we inaugurated this lecture, we reflected on the extraordinary legacies of James Cone and Emilie Towns, two alumni whose scholarship and courage and faithfulness did not simply shape theological discourse, but transformed it. They refused to allow theology to remain abstract or detached from the cries of the oppressed. Instead, they insisted that theology must speak to the realities of systems that needed transformation, of thinking that needed to be challenged and expanded, and that this transformation and challenge and expansion needed to speak from the lived experiences of the suffering, of the exploited, of the targeted, and the overlooked, unmasking injustice while inspiring a defiant hope. And that insistence feels no less urgent today. We gather at a time marked by global instability, renewed forms of imperial ambition, and the persistent realities of racial injustice and human degradation. James Cone and Emilie Towns also remind us of why it matters that serious, learned, virtuous people be in positions of leadership and responsibility, and the perils of what is possible when they are not. And in such a world, the witness of Black theology is not optional, it's essential. It names truth where others obscure it. It proclaims life where systems conspire towards death. And it calls the church and all of us into deeper accountability, courage, and imagination. And so this lecture exists not simply to honor Cones and Towns, but to continue the work that they so powerfully advance, to center Black religious life and thought and experience as indispensable to the future of theology, to the church and the world. And it's in that spirit that we are especially honored this afternoon to welcome Dr. Anthony Reddie, who will be formally introduced a little later in our program. Dr. Reddie, we are so grateful for your presence among us, for the global perspective that you bring, and for the ways that your work continues to expand and challenge the fields of theology and education in this critical moment. When I first heard you lecture, and I mentioned this to him just a few moments ago, when I first heard you lecture a few years ago in the UK, I was blown away. And I came back and I said to Dr. Blunt, we have to figure out a way to bring him to Garrett. And I'm so grateful to you for allowing us to do that. So thank you for being with us. And to all who are gathered here, both in this space and online, thank you for being a part of this community of learning and reflection and of witness and action. Thank you for the ways in which you seek to honor the legacies and the lives of James Cone and Emilie Towns in your own lives and ministries. Our world needs their kind of bold theological imagination and unapologetic dynamic faith. And today is but one way in which we seek to strengthen our minds and our bodies for that work. So thank you for being a part of that, and welcome.
I am so honored to stand here at my alma mater, and I give honor to God, and I give reverence to all of you amazing people for being in this space. I see former classmates and former professors, and to the legendary one. This man has been a tremendous blessing in my life. From the first day I stepped foot into these hallowed halls until this very moment, he's been a trusted mentor, father figure, and friend. And I give God praise for the life of Dr. Reggie Blunt. And I thank you so much just for all that you've poured and instilled into me, to President Vieira, to everybody. I don't want to start calling names, but I am just so happy to see everyone, from Dr. Shara Anderson to Dr. Teasdale, my first professor when I got here. I am just incredibly honored to stand before you. I just want to welcome in Holy Spirit. And if you know the words of the song, I invite you to sing with me. If you don't know it, you got about 30 seconds to learn it, or we'll just catch you up on the other end. This is a beautiful song. I love singing in church, and I just pray it blesses you. Oh Lord, we give you praise, and oh Lord, we bless your name, and we lift our voices to say thank you for your goodness and your mercy toward us, for your goodness and your mercy toward us, for your goodness and your mercy toward us, we offer praise. Oh Lord, we give you praise, and voices to say thank you for your goodness and your mercy toward us. For your goodness and your mercy toward us. For your goodness and your mercy toward us, we offer praise. You are worthy of glory and the honor, worthy of the praise. For your goodness and your mercy toward us. Anybody in here know that God has been good, 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 good? And your mercy toward us, not from my mouth only, but from my heart I say, for your goodness and your mercy toward us, we offer praise. You are worthy of glory and the honor, worthy of the praise. That's why I wave my hands and say, for your goodness and your mercy toward us, I can say that God has been good. Your mercy toward us, it's because of your mercies that we are not consumed. For your goodness and your mercy toward us, even in the situation we find ourselves in, we can say that God is with us, God is present, and his mercy is toward us. For your goodness, your mercy toward us, we offer
Wow. Good afternoon. As noted in our bulletin, I will be reading an excerpt from James Combs' For My People, Black Theology in a Black Church, pages 197 through 199. Thank you, Dr. Vaughn, for the opportunity. It reads as follows. Christians are called not only to pray for justice, but to become actively involved in establishing it. Black churches have a special responsibility for the world because we claim that Christ died to redeem it. We are thus called to bear witness to God's redemption of the world through what we do and say. When others give up in despair, feeling overwhelmed by the enormity of the evil that engulfs us, Black churches continue to preach hope, because when a people has no visions, it perishes. What vision do we have? Are we going to continue to preach the same old sermons, pray the same old prayers, and sing the same old songs as if that alone will be enough for the establishment of freedom in the 21st century? Are we going to continue with the same old church meetings and conferences, electing officers and bishops, holding revivals and hearing charismatic speakers, buying old white churches and constructing new ones, appointing and calling pastors on the basis of a superficial emotional appeal, shouting and testifying for the saints while the world around us continues towards destruction? Is that all we have to offer our Black people? How can we sing glory hallelujah when our people's blood is flowing in the streets and prisons of this nation? What do we Blacks have to shout about when our families are being broken and crushed by political, social, and economic forces so complex that most of us do not know what to do to resist them? This is the paradox, the contradiction that makes faith necessary if we are to survive oppression, and analysis necessary if we are to overcome it. To pray for justice without analyzing the causes of injustice is to turn religion into an opium of the people. The time has come for the Black church to take a critical look at its visions with the intention of radically changing its priorities. I realize, of course, that we cannot expect most African American Christians to take the initiative to effect radical changes in the vision pursued by the churches. But there are many pastors, bishops, and lay leaders who can take the initiatives because they know what is wrong with the churches and they have the talent for leadership to effect significant change in the entire Black community. Such persons will need to incorporate prophetic self-criticism in their own ministry and to be open to a divine call that is not limited to or controlled by a denominational Black church hierarchy. They would not use the apostasy of the white church as a way of justifying the growing opportunism among Black church leaders. Although we must criticize the white church, and I've done my share of that, it is important to remember that the Black church will have credibility only to the degree that we recognize and acknowledge our own shortcomings and truly seek to overcome them. They include our lack of ecumenical spirit with each other, the unbridled egotism and dishonesty among Black preachers, and more concern for raising money for the pastor's anniversary or to build a new building than to house, feed, and assist the poor. Although there are many shortcomings that are obvious to any observer of the Black church, few persons on the inside say or do anything about reclaiming the integrity of the faith maintained by the church. My concern is not to indict any one specific group, whether bishops, pastors, or lay leaders. All of us are responsible, and it is essential not to evade responsibility or to make excuses for evil. Excuses for evil serve only to justify its continued existence. Bishops, pastors, and other church leaders have a special accountability to the people whom they serve and to the God in whose name they claim the right to serve. In God's name and in the name of human decency, the people must demand accountability from those in authority over it, or it will be enslaved by them. The church will never become an instrument of liberation as long as its leaders enslave the ones they are supposed to serve. Black church persons must rise up and claim the right to fashion church structures that are humane and liberating. We must demand a new vision from our leaders or get new leaders who believe the gospel that the church preaches. Black theologians also have a special accountability. We created a prophetic Black theology during the 1960s that called on Black churches to remember their liberating heritage. We reinstated the memory of our ancestors, their stories, songs, and sermons that subverted a social order that exploited and dehumanized Blacks and other people. But today we Black theologians seem to have forgotten our own theological history. Black theology is in danger of becoming respectable in a corrupt church and in seminaries that favor the privileged. It is in danger of becoming nothing but a means of guaranteeing our professional status in white academic circles. We have not remained on the cutting edge of history, but have turned the revolution we started into a church social and cocktail party among black and white academic elites. We must remember that the vast majority of our people are not fighting for ideas, for things in anyone's head. They are fighting to win material benefits, to live better and in peace, to see their lives go forward, to guarantee the future of their children. Therefore, they are not interested in our cute academic games. They are in need of new ideas about their liberation. Although some black theologians return to the black church, most have dropped the prophetic critique of the black churches that gave birth to black theology in the 1960s. In this context, black theology is in danger of becoming nothing but the justification of the churches as they are. How can black churches renew themselves without a black theology of renewal? How can the churches read the signs of the times if there are no prophetic theologians who can distinguish truth from heresy? Too many black theologians are overly concerned about making it in the system. Success in the system never created true prophets, only false ones. The fate of the theologians will be the same as that of the churches that gave birth to them. This lack of vision in the churches is mirrored in the civil rights movement because the two have been closely related. It is not my intention to question the integrity of any black civil rights leader or public official, but we do have the right to put certain questions to all of those who say that they serve the people. Why is it so many of our leaders' actions bespeak concern about their own personal success rather than radical commitment to the black poor? Why can they not think new thoughts? For example, political alternatives not presently available in the Democratic and Republican parties. There is no better symbol of the failure to think new thoughts than the 20th century observance of the historic March on Washington. Much has been said about the event negatively and positively, and I do not deny its symbolic value for those who are fighting for justice. But after 20 years, we should have had more to offer our people than simply a memorial of a dream. May the Lord add a blessing to the reading of this word.
I am reading an excerpt from Emilie Towns' Womanist Ethics and the Cultural Production of Evil, pages 163 through 165. To combine challenge with hope is powerful, for together they enable us to press onward when we are at the verge of giving up, to draw strength from the future, to live in a discouraging present. Challenge and hope make it possible for us to see the world not only as it is, but also as it can be, so that it can move us to new places and turn us into a new people. This has the relentless and timeless force of water on the rock of the entrenched evils of the fantastic hegemonic imagination. Ultimately, the water wears the rock away through an unwillingness to alter its course. Yes, there is something about challenge yoked with hope when it is grounded in living for tomorrow as we live for today, that is solid enough to sustain our lives and overcome skepticism and doubt that the cultural production of evil encourages within us. But it is frightening because we know that loving and caring for others and ourselves interrupts the mundane and comfortable in us and calls us to move beyond ourselves and accept a new agenda for living. Hope cannot simply be given a nod of recognition, for it demands not only a contract from us, but also a covenant and a commitment. When we truly live in this deep walking hope, then we must order and shape our lives in ways that are not always predictable, not always safe, rarely conventional, and protest with prophetic fury the sins of a fantastic hegemonic imagination and theological worldviews that encourage us to separate our bodies from our spirits, our minds from our hearts, our beliefs from our action. Perhaps this is the most devastating impact of the cultural production of evil. It begins its work with the rending of the marvelously complex, interlocking character of our humanity. Therefore, we must yoke challenge and hope in our lives such that justice and peace mean something and are more than rhetorical ruffles and flourishes. To do so recognizes that none of us can hide from any of the isms: war, the economy, confirmation processes, rising oil prices, my God, calls by a conservative Christian leader to assassinate a duly elected president of an oil-rich nation because it is cheaper, Jesus, than another $200 billion war. HIV and AIDS, terrorism, and mixing jingoism with the death of innocence in our national mourning. We cannot hide from the responsibility or accountability, for we are never relieved from the responsibility that we have to our generation and future generations to keep justice, peace, and hope alive and vibrant. Ultimately, somewhere deep inside each of us, we know that perhaps the simplest, yet the most difficult answer to the challenge of what we will do with the fullness and incompleteness of who we are as we stare down the interior life of the cultural production of evil is live your faith deeply. This is not a quest for perfection, but for what do we call in Christian ethics the everydayness of moral acts. It is what we do every day that shapes us, and where both the fantastic hegemonic imagination and the challenge to dismantle it are found. It is in these acts that what we do says more about us than those grand moments of righteous indignation and action. The everydayness of listening closely when folks talk or don't talk to hear what they are saying. The everydayness of taking some time, however short or long, to refresh ourselves through prayer or meditation. The everydayness of speaking to folks and actually meaning whatever it is that is coming out of our mouths. The everydayness of being a presence in people's lives. The everydayness of designing a class session, or lecture, or reading, or writing, or thinking. The everydayness of sharing a meal. The everydayness of facing heartache and disappointment. The everydayness of joy and laughter. The everydayness of facing people who expect us to lead them somewhere, or at least point them in the right direction and walk with them. The everydayness of blending head and heart. The everydayness of getting up and trying one more time to get our living right. It is in this everydayness that we the people are formed, and we the people of faith must live and be witness to a justice wrapped in a love that will not let us go, and a peace that is simply too ornery to give up on us, not even in the vice grip of the fantastic hegemonic imagination, as it serves as handmaid and manservant to the cultural production of evil. Won't you join me?
Need your help on this one, okay? So I'm not going to ask you to sing because we didn't have rehearsal, but I'm going to ask you to snap your fingers with me. Is that okay? Good. Speak to my heart, Holy Spirit, give me the words that will bring new life. Words on the wings of the morning. The dark clouds will fade away if you speak to my heart. Speak to my heart, Holy Spirit. Message of love to encourage me, lifting my heart from the snare. How you love me and care for me. Oh, speak to my heart. Speak to my heart, Holy Spirit. Give me the words that will bring new life. Words on the wings of the morning. The dark clouds will fade away if you speak to my heart. Speak to my heart, Holy Spirit. Message of love to encourage me, lifting my heart from the snare. How you love me and care for me. Speak to my heart. Speak to my heart. Speak to my heart. That's our prayer. Speak to my heart. Speak to my heart. Speak to my heart, Lord. Give me your holy word. If I can't hear from you, then I'll know what to do. I won't go alone. Yeah, I never go on my own. Just let your spirit guide and let your word abide. Speak to my heart, Lord. Give me your holy word. If I can't hear from you, then I'll know what to do. I won't go alone, no, never go on my own. Just let your spirit guide and let your word abide. Speak to my heart, Lord. Give me your holy word. If I can hear from you, then we'll know what to do. We'll never go alone. You'll never go on your own. Just let God's spirit guide and get your word abide. Speak to my heart, Lord. Hey, give me your holy word. If we can't hear from you, then we'll know what to do. We'll never go alone. Never go on my own. Just let your spirit guide and let your word abide. Speak to my heart. Speak to my heart. Speak to my heart, God. Speak to my heart. Our prayer is speak to our heart. Speak to our hearts. We need direction. Speak to our hearts. Speak to our hearts. And we'll say yes, 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 yes. we'll say yes. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, Lord. One more time and I'm sitting down. Yes. Yes. Oh, yeah. Yes. Yes, Lord.
Before I introduce our speaker, I want to say thank you for your ministry. Thank you for ushering us into a space of worship tonight. This is more than just learning. This is a place to experience the Lord, and you have helped us do so. So thank you. I have the pleasure of introducing our Cones Towns lecturer for tonight, which is Dr. Anthony Reddie. Professor Anthony G. Reddie is the professor of Black theology in the University of Oxford, which is a historic first ever appointment. He is also the director of the Center for Black Theology at Regent's Park College in the University of Oxford. An extraordinary professor of theological ethics and a research fellow in the University of South Africa, Professor Reddie is the first Black person to get an A rating in theology and religious studies in the South African National Research Foundation. And this designation therefore means that he is a leading international researcher. He has a bachelor's in history and a PhD in education with a concentration in theology, both degrees confirmed by the University of Birmingham. And he is a prolific author of books, articles, and chapters and edited books. And some of those books include Intercultural Preaching, which he co-edited with Sidel Abel Bonages and Pamela Sell, and also Theologizing Brexit, a liberationist post-colonial critique, which is the first intercultural and post-colonial theological exploration of the Brexit phenomenon of 2016 in the UK. And his latest book, Living Black Theology, Decolonizing Knowledge, where he, among other topics and other things, reflects on ideas such as theological education, Methodist studies, and decolonial theology. And most recently, there is a volume that he has been able to write, which is titled Introducing James Cone, a Personal Exploration. He is also the editor of Black Theology, an international journal, as well as a recipient of the Archbishop of Canterbury's 2020 Lambeth Lanfranc Award for Education and Scholarship, which is given for exceptional and sustained contribution to Black theology in Britain and beyond. He is a member of the Archbishop's Commission for Racial Justice in the Church of England. And in September 2023, he was appointed as the Professor of Black Theology in the University of Oxford, which is the first appointment of its kind in 900 years. So, without further ado, may we give a warm welcome to Professor Reddie.
I'm always amused when people clap you before you've even said a word. I'd first like to offer profound thanks to Dr. Reggie Blount for the invitation to come to this hallowed place, and also for the kind words. Actually, from President Vieira, I genuinely can't remember the occasion on which we met, but I'll pretend that I do, but I really don't. And of course, special thanks to James H. Cohn and Emilie Towns, who are genuinely, I guess, two of my heroes who have actually inspired my work. Okay, so two apologies, or at least caveats, before we start. First is that I have a Yorkshire accent, and so therefore I will be speaking slowly so that you can follow what I'm saying. I do tend to get excited when I speak, and the more excited I get, the faster I talk. So therefore I will be determined not to get excited. A black theologian who's not excited sounds like an oxymoron. And I'm sure Professor Cohn is turning in his grave at the idea of a black theologian who is not excited. Secondly, normally I speak extempo. I have been blessed with having a memory that I get from my mother, which means that most times I can remember and memorize what I'm going to say, so I don't need notes. And also, I'm normally a storyteller, and so that usually means that I kind of like to think that I'm doing a kind of jazz riff improvisation thing. But on the basis that Garrett-Evangelical has spent quite a lot of money to fly me out and put me up in a hotel, I figured I should at least pretend I've done some work. And so therefore I've written a script, which I will read slowly. I want to start by playing an experiential game. In my most recent book, Living Black Theology, Decolonizing Knowledge, it's my first book for the prestigious Oxford University Press, available in all good bookstores and in some that are not so good. I speak about the idiosyncratic journey I have taken to become a scholar, an academic black theologian. It was never my intention to become an academic. My initial dream was to be a playwright, somewhere between James Baldwin and August Wilson, with a bit of Wole Soyinka also thrown in for good measure. But with no one spotting my obvious genius, I had to earn a living in the meantime. And so following my undergraduate studies in medieval and modern history at the University of Birmingham, I found myself working as a youth pastor for two black majority Methodist churches. I was born into and still consider myself to be a Methodist of sorts. One of the tasks of my role as a youth pastor was to help black children and young people associated with these two churches and to help them navigate life in a racist city like Birmingham. And of course, what I mean is the real Birmingham in the West Midlands, not Birmingham, Alabama. And the emphasis on the workshops I led was on life skills, inculcated via models of Christian education and formation work on a Friday evening in youth clubs and on a Saturday morning in Sunday school. And one of the skills I developed, which has served me well for my future career, was the ability to create embodied experiential learning exercises that doubled as forms of conscientization. These exercises served as enacting metaphors that would assist my black young learners to understand their lived experience and realities better, in order that they could navigate a white majority world with the necessary skills to survive and even thrive. My development as a scholar has been concerned with the attempt to combine Christian education with black theology in order to provide an accessible framework for the radical reinterpretation of the Christian faith for the transformation of ordinary people. So in effect, my work is concerned with the conscientization of ordinary people, shaping their Christian formation through an exposure to black theology that helps them to think about the rearticulation of the central ideas and concerns of the Christian faith. In talking about conscientization of ordinary people, I'm speaking of two concurrent intellectual moves. The first is the attempt to enable ordinary people to become critically aware of their agency as historical subjects caught up within interconnecting webs of illegitimate power, discrimination, and racial injustice. Secondly, conscientization speaks to a process of the radicalization and the politicization of the self-understanding of the Christian faith, in which solidarity with the poor and the marginalized becomes the radical intent of faith, as opposed to mere adherence to abstract doctrines and church dogmatics. But most of that aforementioned was not in my immediate thoughts in this juncture in 1994. In one exercise, I wanted to help black young people and children with whom I was working to understand the slippery, barely visible, and yet the ruthless, painful reality of white entitlement and privilege in my country. And I've since learned that the simplest games are invariably the most powerful in terms of their learning outcomes. And so in this experiential game I did with a group of young people, I counted out 100 small bars of chocolate. And I divided the group into two. And to one group I gave 95, and the other group I gave 5. So the ratio of 95 to 5 is clearly inequitable. So much so that the group with only 5 began to immediately complain. They asked on what basis was this divide made. Even the group with 95 were feeling a little embarrassed, but crucially, not unhappy. In fact, a few of the more dominant and forceful members of this advantaged group soon began to assert that there must be some reason why the division was made the way it did. What if the 95-5 divide is in fact a fair representation of the difference in quality, ability, and potential between the two groups? Clearly, for the dominant group, they have this immediate sense that perhaps this distribution is fair after all. For those on the other side of the divide, obviously nothing could be further from the truth. The people with only 5 soon quickly agitate for more equality and justice as they see it, which is clearly a different perspective to some in the dominant group. And so even in this simple exercise, the crucial point of learning at this early juncture is that there are different epistemologies at work in the two groups. So the fight for justice on the one side is met with a desire to preserve the status quo on the other. Please hold this in mind as we move from a simple game to our critical reflections on the nature of British and American politics at this present time. So back to the exercise, I asked the group to construct their arguments and to present them to me and to the other group in order to justify either change or the status quo. On the basis of their arguments and agitation, I decide that I will take away 5 chocolate bars from the powerful group and give it to the other group. So the ratio is now 90 to 10. Still hugely in favor of the dominant group, the more advantaged group. And so we continue to discuss and debate for another hour. After much hard discussions and arguments and threats of walkout, the ratio eventually moves from 95 to 5 to 75 to 25. So the people who now have 25, they still know that they have been discriminated against, but at least they are 5 times better off than when the game first started. But they know there is still a long way to go before there is true equity. But in the dominant group, they are feeling incredibly angry and frustrated because they are focusing on the 20% they've lost, not on the 75% they still hold. So I asked the dominant group if they're prepared to give up any more of their chocolate bars, and they flatly refuse. They have said that they've already lost too much. Their focus is not on the 75 they still have, but the 25 they think has been unfairly taken off them. This was an exercise I did in 1994. I had long forgotten about it as the following year I started my doctoral studies, which was a PhD looking to bring Christian education, particularly critical pedagogy, into conversation with black liberation theology. I often say in shorthand it was Paulo Freire meets James H. Cone. So I dusted off the exercise, and I thought I would try again with a different cohort. So in readiness of this lecture, I did 2 or 3 different experiments with different groups, both an all-black group, an all-white group, and a mixed group. And I tried the same exercise again, and interesting enough, the same dynamic still played out. We started with 95 to 5. We had lots of arguments on horse trading that it got it down, in this case, to 75 to 25. But what was quite crucial this time around, and maybe I suspect it's influenced by the wider politics, to which I'll come back in a moment, that when I pressed the advantage group why they were so reluctant to give up any more, that a number said, well, and I quote one young man, he said, because the game was never meant to be fair. If you wanted us to share, then you should have done that at the start. But the fact that we've started off with an advantage, we are not going to give up that advantage. And one person even said, rather than have equality, I would rather destroy all the bars. It's a simple exercise, but what I have found as I've reflected on it is that perhaps it's a very interesting metaphor for the times in which we're in. That the black theology work I have done and continue to do, certainly in this present moment, is to speak to this sense of a marked reluctance and recalcitrance on behalf of a powerful group who already have a marked advantage, and yet their concern is on what they have lost rather than what they still possess. Moving from a game to reality. In the summer of 2024, Britain was engulfed by a wave of white, nationalistic, racist mob violence, venting its visceral anger largely at working-class Muslims and asylum seekers and refugees. In the so-called protests, and by the way, it's interesting to note how white people get to be protesters, but black people are simply called rioters. That in this context in Britain, one saw very little in the way of class solidarity between predominantly white working-class communities and those living amongst them, largely Muslims and other people of color. On Monday, the 29th of July, 2024, 3 young white girls, B.B. King, Elsie Stancombe, and Alice De Silva Aguiar, were murdered in a knife attack in a northern town called Southport. Following these tragic events, widespread unrest and serious disorder broke out in many towns, particularly in the north, but actually all across the UK. And what started it was the fact that the assailant, the man who had murdered these 3 young girls, was an African migrant. Actually suffering from mental ill health. I believe he had schizophrenia. And so the riots and the continued rise in the UK of the right-wing Reform Party, led by Nigel Farage, is a resurgence of the type of white entitlement and notions of privilege that have always played a part in the underlying zeitgeist of my nation. The right is often poorer white people towards the bottom of the socio-economic ladder were reacting to the propaganda of the far right and the belief that Britain was being overrun by asylum seekers and refugees. Just put into context, in terms of so-called illegal immigrants, that's 0.9% of the whole population, 0.9. And yet, fueled by these right-wing agitators, this sense of resentment was fueled by politicians who had told the Britain with the connivance of the media that there was a mass horde of uncivilized and dangerous immigrants seeking to take over the country and relegate white people from their hitherto unchallenged positions of power and privilege. And so, as I said, the exercise, first devised over 30 years ago, has been dusted off and been reused. And it's been reused often to remind my white audiences in the UK of the unnamed and unstated and yet very real white privilege and sense of entitlement that has long existed in my nation, but also in yours as well. So the past 50 years have seen a tremendous amount of social change in both contexts. The election of a black president would once have seemed so ridiculous and outlandish, and yet it did happen. But I'm reminded that in Richard Pryor's short-lived 1977 network comedy series, there was one skit where Pryor is the first black president taking questions from a racist white press corps in the Oval Office. And some of you actually may have seen that particular sketch from his 1977 comedy series. And of course, the joke of the sketch is, actually, so could you ever imagine a black president of the United States of America? It is utterly ridiculous. That's the underlying joke of the skit. And yet, of course, it happened. So if Obama is symbolic of the gains of the last 70 years, and the sense that the pendulum has swung symbolically from 95 to 5 to 75 to 25, then the truth is that the present incumbent of this office is a reminder that for many the emphasis remains on bemoaning the metaphorical 20% they have lost rather than the 75% they still possess. White discontent in both our countries rests on the sense that many white people believe that the era of wokeness, which is just a new term for political correctness that used to be the bogey term, has seen them lose power, influence, importance, and esteem. And so the focus is often on the so-called deficits they've experienced rather than the reality that the overall socio-political and economic makeup of the body politic of both our nations, white supremacy has not changed substantially. Yes, there are a few more black and brown people who have found their ways into navigating their rise to the top, but they remain often isolated individuals and are not a concerted threat to the often undiminished power of whiteness. So the black theology work I have sought to develop in the UK has always had a strong pedagogical focus to it. And it seeks to help learners to see and confront a world of huge disparities in which, of course, most white people do not have the sorts of material advantages indicated by the simple exercise I described. But crucially, they are still prepared to defend it, even though they themselves may be mired within the disadvantaged group, along with most people of colour, including most black folk. In the black theology work I do in the UK, I often hear white participants complaining that they're concerned at the bounded and separatist notions of the identity politics often deployed by black and womanist theologians, where the focus on blackness and black experience is believed to create an impenetrable barrier of separation between themselves and the allegedly neutral and objective realities of everyday life and society. The problems with such protestations is the failure to realise that the greatest expression of identity politics has always been whiteness, in which white fragility, paranoia, and entitlement often sees poor, disaffected, and angry white people support and vote for rich white oligarchs and patrician figures who have often been the direct cause of their own poverty, i.e., in clinging on to their sense of white privilege and notions of exceptionalism, it's easier for poor white people to identify with the white skin of others, even those others whose economic policies have a materially disastrous effect on their own economic well-being. This is done rather than being in solidarity with black and brown peoples whose own struggles with neoliberalism has far more resonance with their own experiences than their richer and privileged white skin folk they still wish to revere. It's also worth noting that in this particular dynamic, that we also have to be honest and say that in this particular setup, it's often the case that black men will also vote for a white male oligarch rather than vote for a black woman. So the significance of the internalized oppression that sees people vote against their own material interests because of the power of Christendom and empire and whiteness is one that black theology is committed to try and deconstruct. So on to section 2, which is the significance of black experience. What first attracted me to black theology and later womanist theology was its focus on black existential experience. Most academic white theology still often focus on intellectual abstractions and seemingly pointless metaphysics, with little or any attention given to the lived realities of poor and marginalized peoples in the world, which has rarely, if ever, been fair or just. I still remember sitting in one of my first graduate seminars and listening to a then white luminary in systematic theology in the UK who gave a presentation theorizing on the immanent Trinity and the workings of the triune God. That is a whole hour of my life I'll never get back. His paper, a brilliant exposition on the inner workings of the Trinity, but written from a kind of form of hubris that almost made you think that as the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit were in conversation, he's sitting next to them, taking notes. Such was the confidence with which he was writing. And yet the same man was utterly oblivious to the divisions in the church in which he was based as an associate minister. In the latter, in this church where he was associate minister, all the black people sat at the back, held no office, arrived 5 minutes before the service started and were gone within 10 minutes of it finishing, and played no part in the cultural, leadership, or ceremonial life of the church. But clearly, this demonstrative, embodied reality was of no concern to him. His focus was on a God he could not see, not on the black people he could, but chose not to see, as a deliberate act of obtuse will. And yet he is deemed by many to be a great contemporary theologian in the UK and across the world. As I stated at the outset, my ambition was never to become an academic theologian. This vocation arose one afternoon when, seeking to escape the rain, I ducked into a black cultural bookshop in Birmingham. And seeking to kill time until the rain stopped, I picked up a second-hand copy of Volume 1 of Black Theology, A Documentary History, 1966 to 1979, co-edited by the late greats Gerard S. Wilmore and James H. Cone. As I read through the first few chapters, utterly enthralled, the owner, a very gruff and uncompromising black man called Marcel, for whom the customer was never right and always invariably wrong, he came up and snatched the book out of my hand and said, "Hey boy, this is a shop, not a library. Either buy the book or put it down." So I bought the book. And in that moment, my life changed. I was 30 years old. And for the next 24 years of my life, James Hal Cone was my hero. I then devoured his black theology and black power and a black theology of liberation. And my life was set on the path to which I believe God has been guiding me ever since. James Cone, 1938 to 2018, was the grand patriarch of black liberation theology. And whilst there has been a form of black theology in existence since the era of transatlantic chattel slavery of Africans, Cone is credited with creating the modern systematic dimension of this discipline. And from the outset, Cone created an epistemological break in how black theology should be conceived when compared with hitherto established forms of theological inquiry. In establishing black theology as a theology of liberation, Cone creates alternative understandings of the doctrine of God, of Christology, of soteriology, biblical hermeneutics, theological norms, and ecclesiology. On many occasions, especially in the first iteration of what became black liberation theology, Cone was at pains to state that black theology was a practical theology. In making this claim, Cone was not meaning to suggest that black theology adhered to the basic tenets of practical theology as a form or discipline. The latter, practical theology, is often varied in conception and in the ways in which it is expressed, often perceived as the interplay between theological tradition and the context and the lived experience of religious practitioners. James Cone was not a practical theologian in the formal sense. He was trained as a systematic theologian and saw the discipline in very systematic, formal academic terms. So if Cone therefore was a theologian whose work was focused on the intellectual probing of the formal categories, ideas, and theories that govern the Christian faith, then what did he mean by asserting that black theology was a practical theology? A clue, I believe, can be found in his first book, Black Theology and Black Power, as he outlines the social and political context that gave rise to the development of black theology. In this book, Cone writes, and I quote, "On the American scene today, as yesterday, one problem stands out. It's the enslavement of black Americans. But as we examine what contemporary theologians are saying, we find that they are silent about the enslaved condition of black people. Evidently, they see no relationship between black slavery and the Christian gospel. Consequently, there has been no sharp confrontation of the gospel with white racism. There is then a desperate need for a black theology, a theology whose sole purpose is to apply the freeing power of the gospel to black people under white oppression." End of quote. In this quotation, Cone is establishing a clear methodological criteria for black theology, namely its relationship to the experience of oppression of black people, firstly in America and then across the world. And his point of departure for black theology is not abstract theory or developing new and intriguing forms of intellectual thought for their own sake. Rather, the essential first step in creating black theology has always been existential need. In suggesting that black theology is a practical form of theology, Cohn meant to indicate something of the nature and character of the discipline. The emphasis for Cohn was always on the need for black theology to be of practical service to ordinary people, trying to make sense of the absurdity and the often futility of black life in a world run and defined by white supremacy. I still remember when I was doing my doctoral thesis that one of the quotes that guided the work was a quote by a scholar who, to the best of my knowledge, never became a big household name, a religious educator called Keith Chisholm, who in a special symposium in religious education in 1969 that was developed on the back of Cohn writing A Black Theology of Liberation. And so in religious education, the question was, what is the challenge to black religious educators in response to Cohn's towering and revolutionary book? And Chisholm said this. He said, the challenge for black Christianity has always been essentially an existential one. What does it mean to be black and Christian in a nation where many white people claim allegiance to the former whilst despising the latter? I'll say that again. Black Christianity has had at its heart an existential challenge. What does it mean to be black and Christian in a nation where many white people claim allegiance to the former whilst despising the latter? And certainly given the number of white evangelicals who voted for Donald Trump, it tells you that not a lot has changed from 1969 until now. In this regard, then, let's go back to the experiential exercise I first created over 30 years ago. So the exercise, the simple game, starts from the absurd notion that when resources are being dispensed, one group can get 95% and the other only 5%. And even relatively unskilled or untrained young people can see that this patently is not fair. But not is it not fair, it's just not sustainable. If you have that disparity, you will never get peace in any particular construct that you want to imagine. But most crucially, when I invite the Advantage Group to defend this setup, it's intriguing how quickly individuals move to a form of metaphysics, even theological rationale to justify their situation. This scenario is as it was meant to be. Clearly, if it were not intended to be correct, then why would the creator of the exercise? And it's very quickly how me, who created the exercise, almost then becomes a synonym for God. So God created this in the first instance. Very quickly, the Advantage Group constructs spurious, non-evidential rationale for the clear disparity. Maybe those with only 5% don't deserve any more. Perhaps to give them more is to upset the natural, maybe even the divine nature of things. The great African-American constructive theologian and my friend, Willie James Jennings, has written on the distortions of a doctrine of providence that is linked to whiteness, in which notions of God's grace is weaponized to the effect that disparities and injustice that speak to the realities of black and brown people across the globe is refracted as God's benevolence and righteousness when reframed by white privilege and entitlement. That namely, that the desire of whiteness to maintain its privilege and power is often buttressed by a form of theological thinking in which the God of the Judeo-Christian tradition is deeply committed to a reality of manifest destiny, a will to power in a form of exceptionalism for privileged white people at the expense of those who are marked as the others. And the others have always had a number of names: natives, heathens, blackamoors, colonial subjects, the N-word, which I will not speak, or even as people who come from shithole countries. There's always been names for those of us who are on the obverse side of so-called God's providence. And here's the thing. So the randomness of these arrangements that I said are not based on any evidence. It's interesting how much intellectual energy has been invested over several centuries in order to try to find some genetic proof that whiteness is indeed superior. And of course, it's always failed because, as we know, there's only one race, that's the human race. The races are constructed, yet despite that lack of energy, there is still amounts of money that still gets invested in both our countries in order to try and prove that which has proved to be impossible to prove. Actually, as we speak, certainly in London, there are many companies who are still doing genetic experiments in order to prove that whiteness is still superior. And although courtesy of the worst atrocities of Nazi exploitation, that we don't talk anymore, or at least openly, about eugenics. Two things to say very quickly. Certainly in the 1920s and 30s, prior to the experiments of the Nazis, it was easier to talk about the few politicians who didn't believe in eugenics than all the ones who did. But obviously the extremism of Nazism actually put that to an end. Or so we thought, but actually many firms are still investing in forms of gene experimentation with a view to eugenics, to control the sexual reproduction of the wrong type of people. Certainly within the British context, there was a policy to sterilize black women in the 1960s and 70s, involuntary. So I have an older cousin who only found out that she'd been sterilized when she went in for a routine operation, when at a later point when she went in for another operation, the doctor just casually mentioned that she'd been sterilized and why had she done that? And she had no idea when that happened. So the critical insight of black theology has been to speak to this massive disparity. And there's all been two clear points of learning, certainly when I first developed it over 30 years ago. And the first was to help black learners to understand the recalcitrant nature of those who refuse to entertain any substantive notion of justice and equity and wish to hold on to their inherited privilege. I'm reminded of a quote that I believe comes from Kate Geneva Cannon, but I say believe because I scoured her work in preparation for this and couldn't find it anywhere. But I'll still say that she made it up because it's such a good quote and she was a genius. And so the quote goes, when entitlement is the norm, equality feels like a defeat. When entitlement is the norm, equality feels like a defeat. And so I go back to the exercise. 95 to 5, it goes down to 75 to 25. And yet the people with 75 are never happy with that. All they can tell you about is what they have lost, even though they have still enormous untrammeled power. Because, of course, there's a form of whiteness that was never created to accept equality. It can only exist on the basis of untrammeled power. But secondly, the key insight of black theology is to remind believers, ordinary black believers, that this setup has nothing to do with God. It has everything to do with white hegemony. This brings me then to the next section, and we're kind of getting to the end. I first came across Dr. Emilie Town's work when I was a graduate student, and I read In a Blaze of Glory and Breaking the Fine Rain of Death. And in both texts, we see the maturing of a towering intellectual whose work has become foundational to the intellectual development of especially womanist ethics. In her socio-political exploration of healthcare issues and the spiritual resources that have informed and sustained black women in the US, these works have become a primer for an expansive understanding of how we conceive Christian social ethics from within the frameworks of neoliberal socio-political and economic white supremacy. I have long held Dr. Towns to be the natural heir, heir to the mantle once held by the great Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon as the greatest living womanist on the planet. In her book, In Womenist Ethics and the Cultural Production of Evil, for which we heard a fantastic extract a short while ago, I believe this is her greatest book. And it's a book that provides a deeply engaged, critical and reflective assessment of the forms of captivity in which we think about how cultural production has fashioned and corrupted the lives of black people within a terrain and a context that's been shaped by the all-enveloping power of white hegemony. It's a book that is magisterial and it's a foundational text that shaped the ethical trajectory for how we perceive the challenges facing human beings in a world dominated by neoliberal socio-economic and political frameworks. If Cohn's work provided the impetus for my doctoral studies and subsequent scholarship, then Towns' work has been influential in how I write. Towns is a poet. Her writing is imbued with a form of lyricism, where the words the words seem to dance off the page. And I have to say that her creative approach to writing has been very influential in my own development as a writer. So in 2006, I wrote a book called Dramatizing Theologies. And the central conceit of the book, which effectively was to use drama as a way of doing black and womanist theology. And my favorite piece at the heart of it was a short drama called My God. And in the sketch, there are a number of black male believers who call out to God, and God appears to them as a black woman. I have to say, and probably, I believe that Dr. Towns is watching this, and so she probably will not thank me for saying that. When I wrote it, the image I had of God as a black woman was indeed Emilie Towns in the days when she still had dreadlocks. So God looked a bit like Emilie Towns for me. It's worth noting that when I used that piece of drama with black believers in churches, many black men found the idea of God as a black woman deeply distasteful and troubling, and would much prefer a white man to be God. Which often made me think about what is it about God as a black woman that finds it so alienating to us, when actually the image of God I had presented in the drama was pretty much actually like many of their mamas. So final section, dealing with white reactionary beliefs and actions. We are living in an age of increasingly right-wing normalcy. That both in your context and my context, we're seeing forms of discourse and action that we never thought would happen. So in my context, several months ago, the BBC felt they need to apologize to a conservative politician because they suggested that the words he had used in a newspaper article could be seen as xenophobic. And so he complained that how dare they use the word xenophobia to attach to his speech, and so the BBC apologized to him. In context, in his speech, he spoke using the old-fashioned old tropes of defenseless white women being threatened by black and brown illegal immigrants arriving on small boats. Man's called Robert Jenrick, and he says, and I quote, "I certainly don't want my children sharing a neighborhood with men from backward countries who broke into Britain illegally and about whom we know nothing." Now, at this point, it's important to remind us that seeking asylum is not illegal. And it doesn't matter how you reach the country of destination, you are allowed to claim asylum. But apparently stereotyping all illegal immigrants as coming from backward countries, or should I say sort of shithole countries, is apparently not considered xenophobic discourse anymore. One of the architects of women's theology was the great Dolores Williams. And Williams was adamant in locating in Jesus' life the transformative paradigm that makes social justice a theological and ethical ideal. And Williams argued that reconciliation and salvation that are conceived solely in terms of Jesus' death simply verify and legitimize the actual physical suffering and conscription of black bodies, especially black women's bodies. That namely what we should look to is Jesus' ministerial vision, in which relationality is central. He meets with and engages with people on the margins and witnesses to their lived experience, which is essential to any authentic praxis of liberation that is actualized in the church. And so in conclusion, the black theology work I've sought to do over the last 25 years and counting actually builds on the towering scholarship of Cohn and Towns. At its heart is a commitment to theologizing in light of lived experience. It's doing so believing that every so-called, in my context, illegal immigrant risking their life on small boats has a particular narrative that is more complicated than being traduced as an existential threat coming from a so-called backward country, or in this context, a shithole country, according to some. Now, to be clear, lived experience is not without its limitations or problems. It's not a repository for axiomatic truth. As I said, certainly in my context, we are seeing an increasing number of black men being encouraged by the growth of not just right-wing politics or popularism, but also of misogyny or misogynoir. They're seeing black women as their enemy and blaming black women for the ills that are performing, that are blaming black women for the ills that are facing black communities. And I have to say, in my context, we have to be very, very conscious of how much money has been given to this new discipline called Black Male Studies. And Black Male Studies, its main vision of hate isn't white oligarchs, it's actually black women. So it's pitting black women against black men. And we know that is what empire always does. It always does a divide and rule in order to maintain its own hegemony. So the work I'm engaged in is one that is witnessing to reactionary forms of whiteness that are trying to take us back and to reverse the modest gains that have been done in the last 50 years. We need to be vigilant against a form of white Christian nationalism that's taken place on both sides of the Atlantic that is distorting the gospel of love and inclusivity taught by Jesus. Black theology, aided and abetted by women's theology, continues to hold to a form of liberative praxis in which those who are often deemed as problematic to the body politic of whiteness are given special treatment. And so I want to end with just a very, very quick black and womanist rereading of Luke chapter 8, verses 40 to 48, in the story in which, as many of us know, and have probably preached in church on many occasions, we see Jesus asked to respond to a request from Jairus, who's the leader of a synagogue, and he's been asked to attend to his daughter who is sick. Undoubtedly, as leader of the synagogue, Jairus has a degree of power and influence. There's no inference that Jairus is a bad person or someone who is not deserving of Jesus' help, but he is a man with influence and power. And yet Jesus pauses on his way to him because he feels power has gone out of him, and as he is touched by an unnamed woman, a ritually unclean woman who should not be there in the crowd and would make everybody unclean, including Jesus himself, as her condition would make everyone unclean. And at the moment, I'm thinking of how much of the rhetoric from within the right-wing media and politicians are happy to castigate immigrants and Muslims as symbolically the unclean people we need to remove from our midst, lest they taint the purity of their so-called pristine and pure Judeo-Christian world of whiteness. And so the key to me in this text, offered through a lens of black experience, of black theology, womanist theology, is that at the heart of it, Jesus restores a woman to a community from which she has been marginalized. And he does so whilst making Jairus wait, despite the significant influence and power he holds. Imagine how differently our world would be if every elected politician put unnamed and marginalized people first and made the powerful and the influential wait. In the exercise I gave, the figures and ratios are made up. And whether one can divide nations and societies into such neat binaries is, of course, questionable. Human reality is immeasurably more complicated than this particular exercise and metaphor would suggest. And yet the power of it remains because even in its simplified state, it reveals a fundamental truth. Namely, a dominant oligarch is and is inclined to want to hold on to power and to preserve its all-powerful dominance and refuse to live with and be sanguine about the relative minor comparative gains made by those who are disadvantaged in a system that was never created for them to flourish in the first place. The exercise is useful for the ways in which, as a metaphor, it speaks to the heart of the unhelpful ways of how we divide resources in the world. And so in conclusion, the pioneering work of James H. Cone and Emilie Towns has been important to me and many others as inspiration to pursue the kind of scholarship that recognizes not just the complexity of life, but also the forms of intellectual obfuscation that deliberately conceal very obvious and taken for granted modes of social, cultural, economic, and political oppression. For example, there's nothing sophisticated or complicated about MAGA. They want to take us back to an era when a rich and powerful group of people controlled the equivalent of 95, leaving those with darker skin as little as 5, and yet be earnest in their belief that as they were doing so, they were doing God's will. We know times and changes and cultures are not static, and yet the task of black and womanist theology remains the same. Speaking black truth to often white, recalcitrant power. Long may that task continue, and so long as some wish to claim everything and are happy to leave others with little or nothing, then black theology and womanist theology must continue. Thank you very much.
Will you join me once again in thanking Dr. Anthony Reddie? We want to honor our time, particularly for those who are on with us virtually. So we encourage you to come and greet Dr. Reddie and ask your questions of him for those who are here present. But I am grateful for each and every one of you who have come out to our third annual Cone Towns Lecture. Watch for the calendar, because we'll be back again next year this time. Thank you all. God bless.